I'm Julie Ross.
And I'm Elizabeth Cohen.
And this is the Parenting Horizons podcast.
Julie Ross is a parent educator and counselor with over 30 years of experience in private practice.
Elizabeth is a clinical psychologist with over 20 years of experience in private practice.
Perhaps most importantly, we're parents just like you.
Through conversations covering a wide range of different parenting topics, challenges, and roadblocks, we hope to give you some practical tools that might just help make parenting a little bit easier.
Nobody's perfect, and parenting is challenging, to say the least. But with a few skills under our belts, we might just be able to be good enough parents and enjoy the journey and our children a little bit more in the process. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Parenting Horizons podcast. I'm Dr. Elizabeth Cohen. I am thrilled to be here with my co-host, Julie Ross, who I just learn from every time we sit together with one of our guests. So I'm so honored to be here with you today, Julie. Today we have a super exciting guest who I'm really thrilled said yes to being on our podcast. I've known of her work for a long time and have learned a lot from her myself. So I'm so happy to introduce Teresa Stern, who is going to tell us a little bit about herself. She has so many trainings and so many skills. I thought it would be best for her to share. So please, Teresa, welcome and tell us a little bit about you.
Okay, thanks so much for having me here. I'll say a little bit about my background. I'm a licensed clinical social worker, and when I went to social work school, this was like a third career for me. And when I went to social work school, at the same time, I began training in somatic experiencing, which I'll tell you a little bit about as we go on. I wanted to come out of social work school ready to hit the ground running as a somatic therapist, and I did. So that worked, and then since then I have done training in a lot of modalities. I would say the unifying thing about them is that they're all experiential modalities more than primarily cognitive, meaning that when you're practicing these kinds of things, you're in the here and now, feeling it in your body and noticing your sensations rather than having it be primarily in a higher brain. So it's sort of left brain versus right brain, really. After becoming a somatic experiencing practitioner, and also I became a training assistant, I trained in IFS, internal family systems, and I did several of those trainings over the years. I trained in EMDR, and I later became a psychedelic therapist, which I do now. I'm a ketamine-assisted psychotherapist. But along with all of those things, I kind of had another track running, which was child and parent therapy. And so I trained, right out of becoming a somatic experiencing practitioner, I trained in something called SMART, which is sensory motor arousal regulation treatment. This is an approach that was designed at the Boston Trauma Center, and it was interestingly a team of child psychotherapists and child OTs who specialized in sensory integration, working together to figure out another way to work with children that wasn't so much just through their thinking minds. So I trained in that, and I've had all the clinicians. I'm the director of a group practice called Mindful Therapy Brooklyn, and I've had all of my clinicians train in SMART as well, because I think it's really important that they know about it. I also learned something called TheraPlay, which is a wonderful approach to working with children, also experiential. And it was originally designed for kids who were in Head Start in Chicago, and I kind of love TheraPlay because it's very simple. The resources and tools you need for it are very simple. They're things you can throw in a tote bag and go to the client's house for a session. That's how it was developed. So things like aluminum foil and cotton balls and lotion, and just like a little bit of flannel. It very simple. So I think that is a great modality. And then I trained in something called a dyadic developmental psychotherapy, or DDP, which was developed by an attachment expert named Dan Hughes. And also, everyone in my group has trained in that. So, and I'm just going to mention one last thing, which is I learned and became a provider of something called the Safe and Sound Protocol, and I have since had all of the clinicians in my group also become providers of SSP. And this is a nervous system based intervention, which I can talk a little bit about. But I guess I'm trying to say I've done lots of work with adults, lots of work with children, but it's all been mostly experiential and often working with clients who have a trauma history.
Thanks so much, Teresa. That was beautiful. And what a comprehensive training you have.
Right. I would
Yes.
agree. It's fascinating, all of it. Can you describe for our listeners a little bit about experiential rather than cognitive? Because I know what you mean, and I'm sure Elizabeth knows what you mean, but I'm not sure that like a parent hearing that you are bringing tinfoil and flannel and this kind of thing, right, into the house is going to know exactly how that works. Can you just give us a brief description about that?
Sure. Yeah. Yes. And it's particularly easy to illustrate this when we're talking about a child and a parent. Because if sit with a 6-year-old and say, do you feel like your mom understands you, or are you mad, or are you mad at your mom, or any kind of a question that's more of a cognitive question, more of a higher brain question, they probably won't be able to answer you very well. That little kid. He might have this feeling of discomfort and squirminess, but he doesn't know why, or what it's associated with. Whereas if you have a mother and child in the room and you say, let's stand in a circle and tap a balloon and see, let's have it go around the circle and see how many times we can get it to go around the circle. That is a really interesting exercise, which is completely body based, because the child and the parent have to tune into one another. They have to modulate to one another's pace and height. If one of them hits it too hard or gets preoccupied and isn't paying attention, the balloon's going to fall on the floor. So it's a way of kind of both monitoring and fostering attachment by letting their experience be the guide rather than what they say.
That's such a great example. And when you're talking, I'm thinking also that somatic work, which we'll talk more about, but that example you gave about the balloon, it really is so much more inclusive for all types of kids.
Yes.
There are some kids, I was trained in cognitive behavioral therapy for kids. Some kids can talk and share their feelings. Many cannot. When I give talks at schools, they say, "What about my kid who doesn't want to tell me how they feel?" And that I think is probably the norm, like more
Yes.
common. And so you're really making therapy, in my experience, what I'm hearing, like more inclusive for different
Hmm.
types of kids who have different levels of emotional awareness and regulation.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's true. I think also there's a common sort of misunderstanding that parents can have, which is my child is super intelligent and super verbal and tells me everything. That does not mean that their brain is developed enough to really have a lot of inner understanding. And I think a lot of times parents mix up intelligence with inner awareness.
What a great point. What a really smart point. I was thinking when you were giving that example earlier that it also, kids' feelings change from one minute to the other. How do you feel about your mom now? I mean, 5 minutes might feel differently. And this
Yes.
idea of, can you talk a little bit about the idea of sharing your feelings, but also introception, like knowing what your own feelings are, and the power of that for kids? I think the parents might not know about that.
Sure. Well, interoception is really perceiving what's happening inside you. And a totally exaggerated, or not, I mean, this is not uh, unrealistic. This happens all the time, but it's a kind of extreme example, is a child who doesn't notice when he's hungry, doesn't notice when he's tired, um, maybe doesn't notice when he has to go to the bathroom. All of those are interoceptive skills. that some people have more of and others don't. And so one of the reasons for doing somatic work is to help strengthen interoception in children.
Yeah. Don't you hear a lot, Julie, and I'm sure, Teresa, you hear this too, like, why didn't my kid just tell me? Or how come they didn't know that this friend was a bad friend or that he kept, and it makes me think of interception. Like, who says they have that skill to
Right.
be able to identify that? So I know, Julie, you've seen that too, right?
Oh, 100%. Exactly. Yeah, I see that all the time. And, one of the things that I talk to parents about with regard to helping kids to locate the feeling words, the feeling, how they are feeling in their bodily experience is I tell parents to make a guess, not a question, are you feeling this or are you feeling this, but seems like you're feeling a little agitated. I can see that maybe you're feeling a little uncomfortable. To give them some of that language so that they start making that connection between a word or a phrase that they could use to talk about how they're feeling and the actual bodily experience. And another thing that I do is to, when parents say, my kid won't talk to me, my kid, isn't talking to me, I try to remind the parent that the kid is expressing emotions all the time in their body language. And that if we're paying attention and focused on the shoulders, the facial expression, the tenseness or lack thereof, that we can go ahead and make some of those guesses as well, that they don't have to talk to communicate.
I'm thinking also, this is making a slight curve here, if that's okay. But when we when I think about how we work with children in my practice, there's sort of like a weave of several different threads. One of them is the child's body simply, which includes their nervous system and their sensory motor system. Um, Another thread is their behavior and their sort of emotional presentation. And another thread is what are they thinking? What's going on in there? What are their inner messages to themselves? And I think that a lot of therapy leaves out that first thread of the body. And so it's not that the other two aren't important, they totally are. But often parents, teachers, like any adults, make what I would say is a mistake of assigning meaning always to a child's behavior, like assigning a sort of psychological or intentional meaning, whether it's manipulation or they're going to have a meltdown because they just are oppositional or those kinds of things. And often there isn't so much a psychological meaning as there is a sensory meaning in the body. Like, for instance, if a child isn't getting enough sensory input, or they're getting too much, either way. And most parents don't even really know how to judge that. In fact, most child therapists don't know how to judge that. It's a very tricky thing, and you do need some training to do that. And I certainly don't want to represent us as occupational therapists, which we aren't. So that they would go into that in a deeper way than we do. Um, but I think getting a sense of what does this child's body need more or less of um, can really help their behavior. Because if let's say a child is always like kind of slamming into people, crashing into things, this is the kid who gets known to be clumsy and grows up with a kind of stigma. Oh, you're so clumsy, Um, it might be that they just needed more proprioceptive sensation. They needed to feel the world kind of coming into contact with their body. They needed to have a better sense of their own gravity and where they were in space and how long their limbs are. Like some of us feel that innately better than others. And so for a child who isn't getting the right sensory diet, it puts them on edge. It's kind of like if you can imagine, that you have this kind of itchy rash that's there all day long, and it's going to make you irritable. And it doesn't mean that you have bad intentions for anyone or that anyone has wronged you. It just means that your body needs something. And so I think it's really helpful to open up that question with parents and for us as therapists to observe and monitor kind of in a diagnostic way, what are we seeing this child doing that gives us clues about what they need?
You're making such an important point about, I keep picturing this kind of holistic holding of the child. And I think this is also culturally, none of us talk about, liking soft or liking tight clothes or how longer hair or shorter hair. We don't have a lexicon about how our bodies are in the world. We just don't. And so it was probably surprising for parents to even think about that their kids' bodies are communicating something about their emotions, not just what they say. And we also, I think, in our culture have very black and white ideas like disruptive behavior and attentive behavior, which unfortunately the way we teach in our schools, one type of sitting is appropriate, where some kids learn best walking around or pacing. And so I think for parents, it's really important for the parents who are listening to just kind of start thinking about the body and your child's nervous system almost as importantly as the brain and their thoughts. And that, we know kids can't learn. We know all the things that the kids, how much the body impacts kids, I think, as therapists, but we haven't really integrated that as much. I don't see that hardly at all. I mean, people ask in therapy, what was your developmental history? But that has nothing to do with like, how do you feel in your body? Do you like scratchy clothes or soft clothes or how do you, when you go to sleep at night, do you have a lot of blankets on you or no blankets on you? When I first learned about crashing, which Teresa mentioned, which is just jumping into like, a wall that has padded or my body would never ever want to do that. That isn't but when my kids started doing that, they were in heaven. It was like crashing all the time to soothe themselves. And I remember some people coming over and thinking, oh my God, why do you have that? We had this enormous beanbag. Like, why do you have this enormous beanbag? And why are they so noisy? And I really had to do a lot of psychoeducation around the importance of regulating your physical body. It's amazing to me how it's so neglected.
Teresa, I have a question for you, which is how can once a parent observes any particular behavior in a kid, whether it's crashing or, not wanting contact, how can a parent learn to interpret that? Like, what should a parent say to themselves? What should be the internal monologue for the parent? Like, oh, I bet this is what's happening, or, and how can they then translate that to action?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, I think when parents are more aware of noticing these kinds of things, like if they have a kind of a framework for understanding it, it really helps. So if it's just, oh, my kid is just wild, he's always crashing, that's different from, wow, my kid seems to need a lot of physical contact with stuff, you know? And when you can make that transition into having like more of a structural understanding of why the child is doing this, then you can start looking into how the idea is not to try to like convert the child out of it, but to give them what they need, I mean, some parents do feel like, oh, they should just be calmer, but if they can't be calmer, then what do we, I mean, in the sensory motor training, they call this satiation. Sometimes kids, how kids like to get on a spinny thing, or like those spinning things in the playgrounds. When my kid was little, we used to call that the barfarama. Yeah, because that's how the parents felt about it. But they can go around and around on that for a long time because their vestibular system is different from adults. It changes as you get older, and you can't stand all that spinning. But some kids really need a lot of vestibular input, which could be spinning, it could be rocking, like being in a hammock or being in a big swing. And so I think once you start to notice, like sort of connecting dots, and you start to notice, oh, my kid seems to need a lot of A, B, or C, then you can think about, well, what would give them more of that? What might they love to do, you know? Or you could take them to a sensory gym and see what they're attracted to, you know?
Yeah.
I mean, it's here in New York City, we have a few of those. But and in our therapeutic work, we have a lot of sensory sort of activities, you know, like the trampolines, the crash corner, the you know, just all sorts of pieces of, you know, little small pieces of equipment and stuff that speak to the child's sensory system. And the first few sessions, usually we're just letting them do whatever they're drawn to, and we're watching. And we're taking that in and thinking, okay, this kid seems to need a lot more deep pressure or a lot more compression or heavy work, you know, like doing hard stuff around the room with weight on him or, you know, whatever it is. And then we can start to work out a treatment plan that incorporates those things and help the parent figure out, you know, what can you be doing at home that would provide some of this? And there's actually so much, like you don't, lots of people who live in apartments can't put a trampoline on their floor, you know, but there are many other things that you can do. I mean, just like a small example, these used to be very hard to find, but now they're easy to get, is a spandex sheet for your mattress. So if your kid needs like sort of a swaddling sensation, they might be really happy crawling into that when they go to sleep at night, and they might sleep better. They might call you less to come back into their room. And when they wake up in the morning, they're better rested. So, like, there's a lot of interventions that parents can do at home.
Yeah. And for those parents, I was just thinking that all of the parents who take kids to the playground, you probably know, right, where they first go. When I was a kid, my parents said, you were always upside down. You were always upside down on the
Right.
monkey bars, right? And I love doing headstands. It's like my favorite yoga move. I love being upside down. And so I think it's about the word that Julie and I talk about so often, about curiosity. So I hope in this episode we're just piquing parents' curiosity to look at what physical behaviors and regulation tools that kids are naturally drawn to, because that's what's so cool, Teresa. You're not adding something in like, hey, you're going with what the kid's nervous system wants more of, or what has worked when you soothe them. And so I would just encourage parents to be really curious and be creative.
And I would also say, and this kind of echoes something you said earlier, Teresa, is that um, be curious without judgment. You
Yeah.
know, so I think so many people look at their children's behavior with a what's wrong with them mentality, as opposed to, I'm curious, I'm going to be an anthropologist. I'm going to sit back and observe, but I'm not going to make a call about whether this is good behavior or bad behavior. I'm just going to observe and see what it might be saying about what my child needs.
Exactly. Exactly.
I just wanted to give another simple example of something that a parent that we worked with did. So they had a little boy who was, we noticed that he would jump off the trampoline, crash into the cushions. He loved doing that. But then he always did something, which was he would kind of burrow like a little animal underneath the big cushions. He liked to be covered and weighted down, and he'd burrow through and come out the other end. And he was always, he was so delighted to do that. And he would do it over and over again. And so clearly there was something about that sensation of the resistance pushing against something big and heavy on top of him and then finding his way out of there that was very important to his nervous system. So I talked to the parents about it, and they, you know, they had seen it in my therapy room. And so they went home, and his bed was in a corner, and they just pulled the bed out like a foot and put a bunch of cushions between his bed and the wall and made him a little burrowing area in there. And he spent a lot of time there, and it was very calming for him. So, you know, it's not like you don't always need anything fancy.
Oh, that's such a great story. I love that. Yeah. And that, again, I think it's important for parents. I'm hearing parents voice saying like, but they have to behave. They can't be running around. They can't be burrowing. And so I'm just curious, like when parents come to you and say that, like that other voice of pulling it in and controlling it, how do you address that?
Well, I think that if a child's nervous system and sensory motor system is getting what it needs, their behavior is going to improve. And so you see, it's not a sort of the kind of, I think this is true of most experiential work. It's not solution focused in that like we're going to get from A to B and that's our goal. It's more like what can we give this child that will begin to make them feel better on the inside and shift their behavior. It's going to sort of happen organically. And I don't mean that they don't need reinforcement or that we might need to, intervene more than that. But I guess, sometimes I talk with parents about thinking of these kinds of interventions the way you think of vitamins. Like there's something you just need every day. And if you take them every day, you're going to be healthier. And that's what it does to your behavior. Um, I guess I wanted, if I don't know if you had somewhere else you wanted to go with this particular thing, but I was just going to say another aspect of somatic work with children beyond the sensory motor is really thinking about their nervous system and in terms of threat response. So all humans have, you know, we have we are wired to respond to threat, and that's why we're still, as a species alive today, right? And weren't somebody's lunch. Um, and our systems default to being in a threat response, and sometimes people get really stuck in a threat response. And so one of the things I always do when I'm meeting a new child, I'm getting to know them with a lens of where in the threat response is this child stuck? Like, are they stuck in a fight response? Are they stuck in a freeze response where they're either rigid or collapsed? Both of those could be a freeze. Um, and or a fawn response where they're just always trying to please everyone and can't really stand up for themselves. Um, and that again is a situation where you're thinking about not what you need to take away, but what you need to build up. Like for instance, I mean, in somatic experiencing, there's a kind of understanding that one of the ways that trauma gets stuck in the body is when something happened to you and you had your body's impulse was to respond in some way, like fighting back or running away or becoming invisible, whatever it was, and you couldn't do it. And children almost never can do that because they're not free agents. And so if they're, say, living with somebody who's abusive to them, they can't fight back and they can't flee. So what that means is that their threat response is thwarted. They're like needing to complete it, but they haven't completed it and they can't. And so we look for ways to help children who have been, and I'm speaking now really about kids who do have a trauma history. How can they complete that threat response that had been thwarted? And I want to just give an example of this. I worked for about a year with a little boy. He was around 5, and he had he lived with his mom in a shelter for victims of domestic violence and sexual assault. And um, the little boy's father had sexually abused him and had abused his mother in other ways. And so they were a family that had really been through a lot of trauma. And for this little boy, a lot of the trauma occurred when he wasn't even able to say anything to anybody about it. He was so little. And I knew that he needed to have a stronger sense of his ability to fight back. He had never had that. And so what I'm going to describe is something that happened months after we'd been working together. Like we had a very trusted bond by this point. But I wanted him. So one of the ways that humans, kind of express the fight response in terms of their motor impulses. One is by thrusting an arm out all the way extended, kind of like a traffic cop, saying stop. And And another way that we feel that we can sort of stimulate a fight response is pressure on the palms. Like if you put your palms together and press really as hard as you can, or if you put your hands up against the wall and press really hard, that often will kind of relieve the need to have to fight. So thinking about this little boy, um, I put my I put my chair into a corner. It was like a rolling chair on wheels, and I sort of lodged it into the corner of the room so that it couldn't be moved. And I sat down in the chair so that I was at pretty close to the height of the little boy. And I offered him my palms, and I said, "You put your palms against my palms, and I want you to press as hard as you can." And he took this very seriously, and he pushed, and his feet, to keep him, upright, his feet were moving back and back. So he was like on a complete angle with his head and hands near me, and his feet were way back there. And he was pushing so hard. I'll never forget. I actually saw sweat dripping down the side of his head. Like his whole body was in that push. And when he was done, and this is always true of these kinds of things, when it's over, it's just over. It just stops. The kid knows it's over. He was like, okay. And he kind of moved away. And you could see that something had shifted in his physique. He looked more relaxed. He looked more, it's hard to describe, but he just looked more at ease with himself. And I felt like that exercise was a very important turning point in our work together. And after that, he was able to take part in games where he could fight a bad guy and win. Whereas before that, he always had lost. So yeah, I guess I just think a lot about, and it also works that some kids are like, we all know the kids who are very explosive and, having meltdowns all the time. And they also have a fight response that's not functioning very well. It's a huge fight response, unregulated, dysregulated, and often will go from 0 to 60. Whereas we all need a healthy fight response. That just means that we know how to advocate for ourselves. A healthy fight response means you can take a pause and consider how to respond rather than just reacting, kind of like a mad dog. And so with the kids who are very explosive, we absolutely work on building a healthy fight response with them.
I just want to jump in here and to make sure that our listeners understand that we're not saying, and I assume we're not saying this, but we're not saying that just because a child has a fight response or a flight response or a freeze response, it doesn't necessarily mean that they have abuse in their background, physical abuse in their background.
No, not at all.
Right? So, because I think a lot of people look to pathologize their kids' behavior and look for a cause for that pathology. But the fight, flight, freeze, or fawn response is a ingrained response, I think, in all human beings. And so we have to be able to talk back to that response. If I suddenly feel panicky, it's not that I've had necessarily any kind of trauma. It's just that got triggered for me. Am I on the right path there, Teresa?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad you pointed that out. I definitely didn't mean to suggest that having, threat responses that are kind of out of kilter means that the child necessarily had trauma. It doesn't. But also, there's so many different kinds of trauma. Like, let's say a baby that's born with colic, or that not born with, but develops colic as an infant. They grow through their early infancy experiencing, nobody can make me feel better. Nothing in this world can comfort me. I can't get consolation. That's I mean, I don't know, I'm guessing, but I would guess that's sort of their inner experience. Like, and so they may grow up, I could picture a child like that having a pretty like dominating freeze response in a kind of collapse, like I just give up, you know. I mean, when I always want to hear about a child's birth experiences and early infancy and all of their milestones, because there often are things, and also what was happening to the parents during those years, because sometimes there are things that we don't really classify as trauma, but that certainly affect a child's nervous system, you know. Let's say one of the parents is suffering from severe depression and isn't very responsive to the child. The child might feel like, you know, where are you? Why are you not responding to me? And they feel like they're not being seen because they aren't being seen. And it's not because the parents had any bad intentions. And or like with a colicky child, the parents might be doing everything under the sun to try to console their child. And in fact, they might be really upset because they seem like, am I a bad parent because I can't console my baby? You know, so I guess I just wanted to say there's a lot of different things that affect our development and the development of our nervous system and our threat responses. And they're not always things that we think of as trauma.
Yeah, and I think circling back to what we said earlier, if we accept this conceptualization that we are a brain and a body and a nervous system, even anything that impacts any of those parts might need to be moved through. When I was learning somatic experiencing, I loved that phrase, like moving it through. It's not that you're fixing something. And so, for example, I remember in some of the trainings, if babies had come out or didn't have they had C-sections, and so they didn't have that experience of being pushed through the birth canal. No shame, that's what happens with some pregnancies, but sometimes they can come out and their nervous system kind of miss that pushing and squishing, and so they can be a little flaily or some other possibilities, and that there's therapists who can help just kind of give that nervous system what it needed. So I think that I think it's kind of unfortunate that the somatic work came from the big T trauma field, because it's got kind of assigned with that. And so then it's like what Julie was saying, like, was it traumatic? But really, I mean, that's why we have, if most of us, many people like to be hugged. That's a somatic regulation, right?
Yeah.
Or we like to go like this if we're cold, moving my hands together, or tap sometimes, or pace. And so I do think it's important to encourage parents to just bring this into the general lexicon, as you said, like taking vitamins, brushing your teeth. It's like the idea of hygiene. Like, what is your nervous system hygiene? How are you
Yeah.
taking good care of your hygiene in that way? And it's very hard. As a parent, it was very hard for me because I had never been introduced to it. And so it's kind of like you're learning it new yourself and then trying to help your kid.
I like that idea of nervous system hygiene, Elizabeth. I think that makes so much sense, and having parents be observant enough about their child's nervous system, like they're observant enough about their child brushing their teeth, right? So that they know how to give the child, if they see that if the child is dysregulated in some way, knowing how to support good hygiene in the nervous system. I love that idea.
And also accepting that the child might have a really different nervous system profile than the parent. You know, like let's say you have a child, you're a really outgoing person and you love to be in social situations, and you have a child who for whom that would be sensory overload. You know, they need quiet. They have to kind of dose and pace themselves with how much social contact they have. And a lot of times parents feel let down or, disappointed, or did I do something wrong, or what's wrong with my child? And I think people who have kids with more sort of significant neurodivergence might be better able to sort of better aware of that need. Like if you have a child who's autistic and clearly is overloaded quickly, then you probably learn we have to stay in quiet environments, and or we have to sort of build up the child's tolerance to be in something more than that, whatever it is.
Right.
Whereas if you have a child who's more neurotypical and you aren't really thinking about that so much, it may not even be in your on your horizon.
Yeah. I think it's a really good point too about, if there's a big reaction, if a child has a big reaction, you might be then more curious. Oh, what caused this? What did this? But if it's these, less, I remember like these smaller ones, like I don't know if all parents have this, but when I would pick my kids up from school, the dysregulation, just to transition from one thing to another was so challenging, especially in winter months where they couldn't then do something for their nervous system. And it was so, and I find this a lot also with parents I work with whose kids have after school, that kind, right? Like that there's no transition for the nervous system either. And so I think it's these more subtle places that are harder to intervene. Teresa, I'm wondering if you agree with that.
I definitely do. Yeah. Like I think um, often there are many. I think that mentioning the subtle things is really useful because I think there's a lot of things that I as a trained somatic therapist might notice, but would really pass by a lot of other people, because they're not looking for them. And sometimes parents think in terms of like, just is my child coordinated or not, you know? And actually, a child can be very coordinated and can even be a good athlete, but have a really weak core, which is going to affect them, them.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's really not obvious. Like you need I'm not that good at picking up some of these things. I have a colleague who is a somatic experiencing practitioner who works with kids who's also an OT, and she will look at a kid and she'll see things I never noticed,
Yeah.
and so, I mean, sometimes things are obvious, like if a child tends to be slumped or never wants to sit up, they always want to lie down. That tells you something about their core strength.
Right.
All of these things, yeah, they're not that obvious, so it's worth it, I think, to if you have any. There are many kids in our practice who we send for a sensory evaluation, so that they can be assessed by somebody who really knows the ins and outs of this.
Yeah, I think another stumbling block for parents is comparison. When parents compare themselves to their children. So I have parents, who say to me, he doesn't have any friends or she doesn't have any friends. And I'm like, does he or she want friends? No, seems to be perfectly content being at home reading a book. I said, but so, okay, whose problem really is that? It's the parents is like, but I have friends. Friends got me through everything. And I'm like, well, maybe your child isn't wired that way. Maybe it's, maybe they are more of a homebody or more of an introvert or whatever. So it's a little bit, I find, too, about, again, kind of going back to the idea of not being judgmental, also not comparing. And another comparison that I see happens is siblings. Well, my son isn't
Absolutely.
like that. My daughter isn't like that. Even worse is when it's twins. When twins are involved, there's a natural comparison that not only the parent makes, but I think the twins make with each other. So I'm working with a parent right now of twins, and they're a little bit older, and they're not young anymore, and the children's behavior is vastly different. You got one who's kind of defiant, you've got one who's very complacent, very happy to do anything. And I'm really working to get the parent to say, you don't have to, they're not comparable. You cannot compare one to another. They're their own individual selves. So I think comparison, it can be a stumbling block for parents.
I was just going to toss in that since we're talking about being non-judgmental, the psychologist Dan Hughes, who I mentioned earlier, who's an attachment expert, he has a one of his frameworks or sort of tools. Everybody, most of these guys love to use their acronyms, and his acronym is PACE, PACE, and I think it's so useful. It stands for playfulness, acceptance, curiosity, and empathy. And that if you if those are the sort of pillars of how you relate to your child, or really the guts of it, it makes such a huge difference. And so, it's actually not sort of our intuitive where we go for most people. It's not intuitive. It's kind of counterintuitive, because especially if the child is behaving in ways you don't like. Because if you're accepting of their feelings and you are curious, I think for a lot of parents, it feels like you're kind of condoning this behavior. Oh, this is fine with me. Go ahead, throw something at me. Whereas, um, I think it's really important for parents to uncouple um, understanding their child's behavior from condoning it, or endorsing it. They're completely different. And an example that I use, again, this is sort of a gross exaggeration that just makes it easy to understand, is that, let's say you have a 4-year-old who's having a complete tantrum because she wants to go out and dance naked in a lightning storm, right? And she's absolutely determined, and she's heartbroken that you're not letting her do that. And so most parents would be likely to like give some sort of a small lecture, like, well, that wouldn't be safe, or, I mean, I don't mean that. I don't mean to sound snarky. Even if you're not a lecturing parent, you would probably try to give a rational reason why she can't do that. Whereas if you're using pace, you would say, yeah, wow, I get it. It would be so much fun. Look how exciting that would be. Tell me, what do you think would be the best thing about being out there in that lightning storm? And like just getting in there with her. So you're letting her feel seen and heard. She knows that you get her, that you care about how she feels. You accept her feelings, you empathize with her feelings, you're curious about them, and you still can't go. But usually the behavior will have shifted after that conversation. I mean, not always, but for the most part, it just changes the terrain between you.
I love that pace. That's so beautiful. I hadn't heard that
I
before. It's
hadn't
really great.
either, and I love that too. And I'm remembering when my daughter was like 3 or 4 years old, and in New York we walk everywhere. We don't have a car, so we were walking, and it was kind of a long way to walk. And she was like, I don't want to walk, and she was about ready to unravel because she didn't want to walk. And I said, inadvertently, I said, I know, it's so hard to walk. And then introduced that playfulness, which was, what if Clifford, the big red dog, came around the corner right now and could carry us where we're going? And she was like, oh, okay, let's pretend that. Let's pretend we're on top of Clifford. And I didn't try to correct her behavior, which was definitely tilting into throwing herself on the sidewalk behavior, but just like how can we introduce playfulness? And it seems to me other areas where that would be where a child is refusing to brush their teeth, clenching their teeth. I know, but you know what? I kind of got to see if Winnie the Pooh got stuck in there, right? And we bring that playfulness to the scenario. I really love that pace. I love that. I hope our listeners wrote that down.
Yeah.
I think it's a really great approach.
Yeah. I was thinking that earlier when you started sharing about the TheraPlay in the beginning, I was thinking, wow, why would we ever create a treatment for a child that didn't involve play? Like that's their main language.
Yes.
I mean, it's such a fascinating, like when you said play and playfulness and for parents too, because parenting can become so serious. And especially these days, I feel like there's like a right and a wrong and a book you're supposed to read. And, that to engage with playfulness for yourselves too. Like, how can you be more playful? And I want to encourage the parents who are listening to, yes, be curious about your children's somatic and interoceptive experiences and proprioceptive experiences. But what about yours?
Yeah.
What about yours? Let's start with you and figure out, let's do some curiosity. Do you like light tickling. Like, remember that game where it's like, can you feel if you got to the middle of my elbow? Do you like that, or do you like hard scratching? In our house, there's a joke that I'm the worst scratcher, a back scratcher of all, because my daughter and husband love hard scratching, and I'm a very soft scratcher. So just kind of bringing that into the conversation. Do you like a tight blanket? Are you always hot? Are you cold? I really want to encourage parents to start thinking about themselves in that way too. I think it'll help because it can seem like a big task to start looking at this in kids. So that's a suggestion. Yeah.
Great point.
Yeah. All right. Well, we're just coming up to the end of this time together, which has been so informative. Thank you for all your beautiful explanations and descriptions. It was very descriptive. And we usually like to ask at the end of the podcast. Yeah. We usually like to ask at the end of the podcast if there's like one thing you feel like you'd like our listeners to know that maybe you haven't been able to say that you'd like to share. We'd love to hear it.
Thank you. That's a good question. I guess there's not really a pearl that's coming to my mind, but I guess just really to say that, when we talk about, like, when someone says, oh, I have a gut feeling about something, we're saying my body's telling me, and children have that too, and so I think just really taking note of that, of knowing that, our emotions don't start like, in our thinking. They start in our body. When you feel angry, you're probably feeling hot, or your fists are clenched, or your heart is racing. And that sort of sends a message to your brain, oh, I'm really angry right now. Right. So I think the more we can, and one of the reasons this is so important is because if we can be aware of this and remember it, we can also notice early signals in our body of feelings that are coming up and do things to settle ourselves and regulate ourselves before things bubble over, And I say this with particular empathy for parents of teenagers.
Yeah, for sure. I love that. I'm so glad you brought up the prevent, like before, right? It makes me think of Dan Siegel wrote that book about mindsight for teenagers, like to kind of know, right, what might be happening before. What a great point. Thank you so much. Thank you for bringing in this, the body awareness. I really think that this is a moment that hopefully lots of parents who are listening, what it feels like for me is that there's another piece walking in the room. There's a whole other piece to look at. And there's so much to do with it, because that's innately what kids use to be in the world, their bodies, not their minds necessarily. So Thank you so much for bringing this really important topic here.
You've been listening to the Parenting Horizons podcast. If you would like to reach Elizabeth Cohen, you can go to www.centerforcbtinnyc.com.
And if you'd like to reach Julie Ross, please go to www.parentinghorizons.com.